Greetings everyone. Welcome to today's lecture on female Bhaktas and the poetry of protest. In this lecture, we will be discussing as to what was the most important theme that one could discern or point out in the poetry that was composed by the female Bhaktas. There are different themes that one comes across in any kind of writing. The theme of love, the theme of pain of separation, or the theme of pure simplicity, bhakti, or any other theme or any other kind of feeling that a human being is going through at a particular point of time. But the most common theme that emerged in the poetry composed by the various female Bhaktas was that of protest. It is with this theme in background that now I would be talking about several female Bhaktas in addition to the ones that have been already discussed. So one such saint, female saint, was Saint Toral, who was the better half of the famous Jaisal-Toral pair, known as the legendary lover as well as the saint pair. Jaisal was a Rajput dacoit from Kutch who was dared to acquire Toral. So the story goes that as he was dared to acquire three things, that was Tati, Toli and Toral. Tati was the famous sword, Toli was the famous mare, and Toral was the woman known for her beauty, piety and knowledge. Now Jaisal told Toral's husband Sansatya about his desire, and Sansatya, in his saintly demeanor, willingly gave his wife as well as his mare. And as the legend goes, Toral agreed to go because she was born with the mission of bringing about reform in the lives of fallen men. Here, this also indicates that after all, a wife was considered as personal property in the patriarchal system, and so she could be easily given away. Now, as the story goes, and as is also it appears in several of Toral's bhajans, on their way to Kutch by a boat, a heavy storm struck and began to rock the boat. And it was at this point of time when Jaisal was terrified of death that Toral remained calm, and she delivered a discourse on bhakti, and it was then that dacoit realized the mistakes that he had committed in his life. Then another very important female Bhakta was Janabai, 1298 to 1350. She also had a very difficult life, as many of her abhangs discuss the daily grind of her life as well as her work, the daily routine of cooking, cleaning and washing, as well as how she was not able to get any time for herself or the way she wanted to spend her time in bhakti. And in her daily grind of life, it was after all her god Vithoba who became her constant companion as well as helpmate. He helped her to carry and heat the bathing water, as well as to sweep the floor as well as to clean the vessels till they gleam. So all these are mentioned passionately in the poetry that was in the abhangs that were composed by her. Then another Bahina Bai, a saint from Maharashtra who lived during the 7th century and is the only woman saint who has written an autobiography as well. She was born in a poor Brahman family of Degaon, and when she was merely 3 years old, she had been married to a priest, Ratnakar Pathak. And at the age of 7, when she came to Kolhapur to live with her husband, and she was the only woman saint who remained married throughout her life. And the important thing was that she was even able to convert her husband to her ways of thinking in due course of time. Common theme that runs across in most of the poems that were composed by the female Bhaktas was a very traumatic married life that most of them went through. And a reading of the poems by all these women saints tell us about the problems that they encountered in their marriage. Many of them had been born in rich families and had led a very comfortable and a loving family life, but that was the situation only before marriage. Their real problems started post marriage, as they were troubled by the in-laws or other family members, because the daughter-in-law was seen as bringing shame to them due to her independent ways of thinking. So, one such female Bhakta was Mahadevi Akka, who clearly mentioned disdain for earthly husband in most of her vachanas. So, as one of her saying goes, I have Maya for mother-in-law, the world for father-in-law, 3 brothers-in-law like tigers, and the husband's thoughts are full of laughing women. No God this man, my lord, white as jasmine, and I will make him my good husband. So these lines clearly indicate that she had rejected all her family members as they were troubling her in one way or another, and she could only accept the Lord, who was as pure as jasmine and as fragrant as a flower, to be her husband. The saying further goes, I love this handsome one. He has no death, decay or form, no place or sight, no and nor birthmark. I love him, O mother, listen. So the Lord white as jasmine is my husband. Take these husbands who die and decay and feed them to your kitchen fires. So it was definitely an open rebellion, and she was kind of disrespecting her earthly husband in very strong terms. Then some of her writings also indicate constant conflict. So as one of the vachana goes, husband inside, lover outside. I can't manage them both, this world and the other. I can't manage them both. O Lord, white as jasmine, I cannot hold in one hand both the round nut and the long bow. So again, this shows that how there was a clear choice that Mahadevi Akka had made, and she was very convinced about the choice that she had made, and she had her own reasons to make that choice. Now, there were a number of difficulties in marriage for several other female Bhaktas also. For example, Lal Ded. Lal Ded had a very difficult married life, and there are several legends that talk about the cruel treatment meted out to her by her mother-in-law. She was often ridiculed for not doing anything right, and often taunted as well that she had learnt nothing at her father's house. So with that kind of criticism, she just decided to walk out of marriage, and I have already discussed in detail the background as to what happened after that. Then the next in line, and a very important female Bhakta, was Meera. In addition to Brij Bhasha, Meera composed her poems in the Western Rajasthani dialect as well as in the regional languages like Gujarati as well as Marathi. Her language had multi-dialectic features, as has been pointed out by several scholars like Bhatnagar and Dubey. Meera dared to speak and claim on behalf of several women the right to dedicate themselves to the ideals of their own choosing and to seek their own transcendence. So, in one of the bhajans of Meera says, the veil is broken and I am liberated from the cycle of birth and death. So she emphatically declares that only when one gives away shame and one does what one wants to, that one is finally liberated from this never ending cycle of birth and rebirth. So the common theme that emerged was the importance of feminine self. So femaleness became something which men also resorted to in bhakti movement. There were several saints like Kabir, Narsi and Surdas who often resorted in their devotion to a feminine self, and for women it was unnecessary to make any such transformation because their femininity itself had become their strength, as has been pointed out by Kumkum Sangari. Now, when we talk about Meera's choice, she did away with all the forces which promoted and symbolized tyranny, injustice as well as bias, while Lal Ded withdrew from the world radically and dwelt in a space of her own. Meera, as a feminist, she questioned powerfully all the constructs ranging from physical to psychological, and she also continued to live in the same environment where she was, and so her struggle was of a different kind. Her poems symbolize the spirit of womanhood as well as feminism. As has been pointed out by Kumkum Sangari, a 15th or 16th century rebellious woman, poet saint who pursued her devotion to Krishna, endured several persecutions because she did not behave as a member of the royal household and she even crossed the caste boundaries. So in a way, Meera was challenging the status quo, and as she was challenging the status quo, she refused to commit sati also when her husband died, and she chose Ravidas, also known as Raidas, as her guru, who belonged to one of the lowliest castes in the Brahmanical order, that is, that of a cobbler, and her association with several saints and bhaktas, irrespective of their gender and caste, are some of the facts worth mentioning. An individual living on her own terms, this is how one could describe Meerabai. Her aspirations resulted in a clear-cut confrontation with her in-laws, as here was a Rajput princess who was singing and dancing in the company of Bhaktas, and most of whom belonged to the so-called lower castes. So this was definitely path-breaking. Then another very important feature that one comes across in most of the compositions of female bhaktas was the element of orality. Lal Ded and Meerabai chose poetry as the medium of expression due to the environments that they were parts of. So there was adoption of oral medium, as the written would have limited takers. Similarity also exists between Meerabai and Lal Ded. Lal Ded, also known as Lala, brought in the vernacular Kashmiri as the language of expression to make it more comprehensible for the masses, and poetry has always been recognized as a more universal and a more acceptable and an interesting genre. She used the universal genre to convey universal messages, thereby avoiding the complexities of prose as well as intellectual languages. So, in some of the poems of Meerabai that have been composed in Brij Bhasha, which was the local dialect of Rajasthan, and several saints, bhaktas and sadhus in her period who had already made poetry the medium of communication were definitely the trendsetters, and Meera in a way carried on with the tradition that was already in practice. Now, one can also say that the poetry of these female bhaktas was some kind of a precursor to feminism, because their poetry portrayed feminist instincts. So it was not as if they were protesting for nothing. There were valid reasons, and these valid reasons were conveyed very well in their compositions. They deconstructed the established ethos of patriarchy, questioning the orthodox principles, and even they dared to speak out the self, which in itself was something very important. And all these features became the basic principles of later day feminism as a movement, when women came out of their homes and they started demanding rights for themselves, and they started bringing it to public notice that how they had some valid demands, and they started objecting to the things that were not humane and which had been going on for generations and for several centuries in fact. So even those practices were questioned. Now, a very interesting reference can be made to some of the vaks of Lal Deds. The sayings of Lal Deds are known as vak. Lal Ded belonged to a Kashmiri Brahmin family and was probably a lettered person. So she was probably literate, yet her language, its diction and norms are quite colloquial and fall in the category of non-classical. So Lal Ded's work has been a significant landmark also in the linguistic transition from old to modern Kashmiri. So their contribution was not only in the field of philosophy or in the field of feminist outpouring, but also in the field of development of regional language and literature. So in the poetry of Lal Ded, a very important theme that emerges time and again is that of giving up worldly pleasures. The poetry of Lal Ded reflects a revulsion for the world. She believed that in order to attain liberation, it was very essential to withdraw from the world and maintain the limits with regard to the temptations. So these were the kind of wise outpourings that definitely had an impact on the contemporary times. She insisted upon giving up the material delights, and her own life exemplified the same philosophy. This is what she says in the following lines: "In life I sought neither wealth nor power, nor ran after the pleasures of sense. Patiently bore my lot, my pain and poverty, and loved my God." So such a beautiful message for humanity, that instead of only aspiring for material goods, one can find satisfaction if one is more internally focused and one has a spiritual bent of mind. So the mystic discourse that emerged in due course of time provided a legitimate space to these female bhaktas, and this was this mystic discourse that helped them express themselves publicly, because after all, their sayings or their life stories ultimately fell in the category of religious discourse. They broke out of the enclosure of hierarchies and dualities and found themselves in a space where the distinction between the inside or the outside blurred, and this was a very important balance that ultimately they were able to achieve. Now, as has been pointed out by Irigaray, the mystic experience as essentially a feminine experience and the total absence of gender was a dominant feature in Lal Ded's works also. Lal Ded ultimately disrobed herself after leaving her home. As she walked out of her marriage, she stopped wearing clothes and she started roaming around naked. She dwelt upon the inner self to understand the real nature of things. She gave up the unnecessary tradition, culture and clothing. Now, regarding the dawning of awareness, in one of the works, Lala says, that became the turning point in Lala's life, and naked I began to dance. Now, there are several interpretations on Lal Ded as to why she behaved in such a manner, why she gave up her clothes and started dancing naked. Scholars like Neelkant Kotru have pointed out that her nakedness symbolized her union with the ultimate, but her roaming naked was a major challenge that she posed to the contemporary society. As has been pointed out by Jayashree Kak, her wandering nude was symbolic of the rejection that she posed to all worldly attachments, including family, friends and home. So ultimately she was rejecting the traditional way of life. And what was becoming more important was unself consciousness. So as has been pointed out by Nirja Mattu, nakedness became more of a symbol and a powerful symbol of her own authority, and so it indicated some kind of a transcendence of her own female self. She became completely unself-conscious and even unaware of her own body, and it was in this unself-consciousness that she ultimately achieved salvation. She refused to be bothered by what people would say or what people would think or how society would react. She was more into her own self and discovering the ultimate truth for herself. So for her, Lord was the real man. When she was asked whether she felt no shame at showing her body to all men around her, she asked whether there was a man around. So in fact, she refused to acknowledge those who were around her as men. And to her, ordinary mass of people they were no better than sheep or other animals, and the only Lord she accepted was the divine being. So with this kind of conviction and with this kind of authority, there were these female bhaktas who carried on the tradition, and most of their compositions went unfettered. So they were singing unfettered, they were singing uncontrolled, and they were adopting unconventional paths to success. The lecture has also explored the kind of feminist aspect in the poetry of several female bhaktas, but also surrounded by their distinct cultural and gender identity. So that was not to be compromised. So we have a particular kind of a metaphor and a gender construct that is being used in areas like Kashmir, and different kind of metaphor emerging in Rajasthan, similarly different emerging in the vachanas of Akka Mahadevi. And hence the regional spirit of bhakti definitely gained a lot out of these developments. So literature over the years has played a vital part in the progress of the world. In addition to serving as a very important platform for expression of several ideologies, it has also acted as an agent of transformation and change at the personal, social, cultural, gender and even political levels across cultures. Hence, when we are talking about the Bhakti movement, one must take into consideration the contribution that several of these female bhaktas made in these path-breaking compositions, which are known by different names like bhajans or vachanas or vaks. And these outbursts not only served as a very important medium of communication, but they also had an advantage that they could reach the wider audience as they were not composed in chaste Sanskrit. So, they were composed in the language of the masses, and hence they could easily convey the varied ideologies in a simpler language. And this also explains that why several of these sayings are popular even today, and how Meera's bhajans have they don't look outdated because of the language as well as because of the metaphors that were used, that largely are reflective of the emotions and feelings that are felt by humanity at large. Now, another very important theme that emerged in some of these sayings was that of breaking taboos. That is, several medieval Indian women poets, and especially Lal Ded and Mirabai, the kind of compositions that they made and also the kind of life that they led is indicative of breaking taboos. So, their life choices, their decisions that they made during their lifetime definitely created an alternative way of thought, and women used literature, poetry as a medium to voice their selves and also to break the social as well as cultural taboos that were existing at a time when feminism was non-existent. So, with this I would like to conclude this. Thank you.